Okay, I'm gonna get started. Welcome everyone. This is the first episode in our webinar series, the Siyaphambili webinar series. And today our webinar is called Adolescent Mental Health in Context of Adversity, Learning from Global Settings. And I'm really excited to be here with you and look forward to an amazing discussion. So the webinar today is following a bit of a structured format. So we'll start with our four panelists giving some brief presentations, and then we'll move into an open Q&A where you are welcome to ask questions via the chat box. Please be aware that we're recording our session today, and afterwards the recording will be available on the Siyaphambili Youth YouTube channel. This is where you can also catch up on any of the other webinars that you may miss in our series. It's great to have many people with us and more joining by the minute. We are working across multiple time zones today, and I think that's a real testament to the importance of adolescent mental health globally. Um, you know, it's a huge sort of concern globally. Statistics are quite alarming in terms of burden and need. Recent evidence suggests that 1 in 7, 10 to 19-year-olds are grappling with mental health disorders, and this interacts with sort of widespread social adversity that many young people are living through in low, middle, and high-income countries that contribute to the development and the worsening of mental health conditions, stretching from issues of living within systemic poverty, exposure to violence, exposure to racism, and substance abuse, and trauma. In 2020, the Siyaphambili Youth Project launched in KwaZulu-Natal, a partnership with some amazing organizations that were all listed on our holding slide. And our aim was to investigate the impact of marginalization on young people's well-being and co-develop with young people themselves interventions to respond to these issues head on. And all of these issues are sort of a cause of concern in South Africa, but also globally. So we're hoping that the learnings from our work, some of which you'll hear about today, remain relevant for people everywhere working around the context of young people's adolescent mental health. So in this webinar, we will be hearing from diverse global settings reflecting on both the drivers of poor mental health and adversity and the challenges facing policy and practice landscapes to enable and promote access to meaningful quality care. Please use the chat box throughout to add your questions, as well as any specific questions for the panelists that we will pick up later. So what I'll do now is introduce each of the panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll also present, so that we'll sort of streamline things as much as we possibly can. We'll be together today just over an hour. So as I said, we'll have short presentations from each of our speakers and then devote most of the time to discussion and question and debate. So first up today, we have the honor of hearing from Professor Claudia Barnard. Professor Bernard is a seasoned professor of social work and head of postgraduate research at the Department of Social, Therapeutic, and Community Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. With a background in local authority children and family social work, she brings a wealth of practical experience to her research and teaching endeavors. And today she'll be talking about adultification of young Black women and resulting mental health concerns in the UK. After that, we will hear from Smanga Makwanazi. Smanga is a senior research scientist at the SAMRC Gender and Health Research Unit. He's a member of the Siyaphambili research team, and he's passionate about exploring the lived experience of young men in informal urban settlements and rural areas. He graduated with a master's degree in development studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he'll be talking about drivers of young men's poor mental health in marginalized communities in South Africa. After that, we will hear from Ahmed Nisar. Ahmed is a fellowship facilitator from Origin Global and has founded an initiative called Changemaker that focuses on finding the intersections of mental health with SDGs 4, 5, and 13. He's an award-winning advocate, having participated in various roles as author, advisor, and speaker for the government entities in Australia and various organizations such as Women Deliver, Global Citizen, and Lancet Commissions. He'll be talking today about young people's access to mental health supports in Afghanistan. And last but not least, we will have a presentation from Serka Ni Kufek. Serka is a PhD student and a mental health expert based at UCL. She has a Master's of Science from the University of Edinburgh in Applied Psychology for Children and Young People. And she will be talking about work from her amazing doctoral studies. And I'm a little bit biased because I'm one of her supervisors. But she will be talking about the evaluating special education needs and disability in the UK, the acronym is SEND policy, and guidelines for supporting the mental health of minoritized children and young people in England. So, as I said, a wide range of topics intersecting with all of these sort of issues and concerns that are sort of structural and embedded in society and how they sort of relate to experiences of mental health of adolescents. So I'm very happy to now turn over to our first speaker, Professor Bernard.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for
Thank you
being
very much. Could you just bear with me for a minute whilst I share my screen?
Of course.
Could everybody see this?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health, adultification of young Black women. And I'm going to draw on two pieces of my work to illustrate themes of adultification and drivers of poor mental health. The first one is a piece of research that I did with young Black women living in a gang-affected neighborhoods to explore how they navigated safety in public and private spaces and how these spaces overlap and intersect. And I've got the reference there for those of you who are interested in that article. And the second piece of work I'm going to draw on is a content analysis of a serious case review. For those of you who are not familiar with the UK context, in terms of statutory and sort of government services, when a child dies or is seriously harmed through child abuse and neglect, there's a requirement to do an inquiry and to do a report. To the purpose of that is to learn lessons so that mistakes aren't repeated by social workers and other practitioners. And this involved a 15-year-old Black girl who was in foster care, who was raped, who was sexually groomed and raped by an older man in the context of sexual exploitation. And again, the reference is there for that piece of work for those of you who are interested. And I think, you know, as we all know, in terms of drivers of poor mental health, children who are living in economically deprived neighborhoods have increased exposure to multiple stresses, serious youth violence, county lines. County lines, for those of you who are not familiar with the UK context, county lines is a concept that's used to describe children who are exploited to transport mainly drugs and other criminal activities from one part of the country to another. Children who are going missing from home and care are at heightened risk of criminal and sexual exploitation. We also know that as a driver for poor mental health, that racial trauma causes mental health problems. And I think one of the things I try and stress very loudly in the UK, that we have to start recognizing and identifying and naming that racial trauma causes mental health problems. Also, we know that poverty, discrimination, stereotyping, and systemic racism increases the risk of poor health, physical health, as well as mental health outcomes. And we also have, in the UK, I stress that we also have to recognize that Black children experience system harm and structural harm. And the final thing that I always stress in my research is that in the UK context, the safeguarding strategies and practices can pathologize and criminalize and harm Black children rather than safeguard them and keep them safe. So those are some key issues that I think is important to understand how they're drivers for poor mental health. Briefly, in terms of adultification, and I'm sure most of you on this call are familiar with the concept, but it's the subtle and unconscious race-based bias that contributes to the treatment of Black children in the child welfare and justice systems in the UK. And the notion is that adultified children are perceived, Black children are often perceived as being older than they are, and therefore as needing less nurturing, comfort, or protection than their true age requires. Black children are often perceived as being less innocent than white children and thus less in need of protection. And Black children are often seen as the risk rather than being at risk, particularly Black boys, but also Black girls are often seen like that in the child welfare system and also the youth justice system. So for me, adultification is a really important concept that we get to grips with. The first piece of study I'm going to sort of just illuminate a few pointers is a qualitative study that investigated how young Black women who are living in a gang-affected neighborhoods navigated their safety in public and private spaces and how these spaces overlap and intersect. So I did a photo voice project using focus groups and guided by semi-structured interviews with 18 young Black Caribbean background and Black African and mixed race Black children with one or the other heritage Caribbean or African background. So the use of photograph as a means to facilitate dialogue was important. And a key theme that came through was the ways that young women normalize the violence that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So there was like an acceptable level of violence. So one young woman says, I've been slapped in my face, to be honest. And of course, a slap is going to hurt you, yeah, but it's not going to scar you. You'll get over it. Obviously, you're going to run your mouth a bit, but you have to stand there and firm it up. So it was young women talking about being tough and being able to withstand a particular level of violence as a way of surviving in unsafe spaces. And not right, but it was normal for them. So it's not normal for a girl to be hit, but from what I know about what I've seen, it's kind of normal for us. If a girl and a boy have an altercation, you're going to get slapped if you're a girl. So that shit's normal to me. So again, that normalization and I think it's important for us to not accept that they normalize it, so it's okay. It's a defense mechanism as a way of coping with an intolerable situation. And one young woman says, best case scenario, being slapped was actually better than being punched or stabbed. Because when you're in drug dealing, territorial conflict between neighbors also engendered violence directed at young women in the area. You've got boys who are slicing girls in their face as a way to attack the boys they were friends with. So here young women were talking about young women who are vulnerable, even though they were not involved in any gangs, but they were vulnerable because they were targets as a way of getting at the boys in their particular friendship groups or neighborhood. And we know that women and girls are vulnerable to the attacks as a way of getting back at males who are involved in criminal activities. And they talked about unwanted sexual contact. People would say, oh, I heard that this happened to you. I'm like, yeah, but what can I say? Get over it. Yeah, I did it. And what? Look, girls are putting themselves in the predicament. And what they were talking about there was things like gang rape. But they were not using that kind of language. So you had to really probe to get a sense of what they were actually talking about. And the one thing that came through very strongly was the thing about hypervigilance. That that heightened state of constantly assessing potential threats, that heightened state of constantly looking over your shoulder. Now, we know that that isn't sustainable in terms of thinking about mental health, and the sort of paranoia and the kind of emotional and psychological and mental health problems that this gives rise to, that hypervigilance. So I'll go on now to talk about the child R, which was a 15-year-old girl who was looked after in foster care and who was raped by an older man. Now, this was a young woman, young woman who had lived in, who had experienced adversity. She was exposed to multiple forms of abuse and neglect in a dysfunctional home environment. Her family and her extended family were involved in drug dealing and other criminal activities. So she was living in a very unsafe home environment. And we know that those environments heightens children's risks of being exploited sexually and criminal exploitation. She'd experienced intrafamilial abuse and neglect and other early life stresses. And the report also emphasized that she would go missing on a regular basis from her foster homes. And that's quite a common thing for young people who are being sexually and criminally exploited. But when I analyzed the serious case review, what came through very, very strongly was how very much this girl was not assessed and reviewed as if she was a child who was vulnerable. The report almost painted a picture. This is an adult who is making informed choices and is very much complicit in the abuse and neglect that she was experiencing. And adultification came through very, very strongly. So there was language used in the report about her being very streetwise, and that's very common in the reports that are written about Black adolescent children, boys and young and girls, that they are streetwise and therefore they can look after themselves. So they're not vulnerable, needing protection in the way that other children might need protection. So no one helped her to unpick the many layers of trauma in her life. And the report didn't pick that up and comment on that. And bear in mind, as I said before, the report is very much about looking at what lessons can we learn here in relation to that we don't repeat mistakes and we keep children safe. And what came through very strongly was the sexualization of R's body, which can mean that social workers may be more likely to see Black girls as complicit in their sexual exploitation rather than see them as being victimized. And what came through very clearly was the ways that racism, sexism, and social class inequalities intersected in complex ways to heighten her risk of sexual exploitation. And those issues were never explored in the report. The impact of sexual exploitation on her mental health was never considered. And in terms of help, her coping strategy and help-seeking behavior, that was never drawn out and explored because no one created a generative space for her to think about her recovery. And for me, what came through very strongly was the issue about misogynoir, that intersection of anti-Black racism and misogyny that was going on and interacting in her, shaping our experiences, were never analyzed and drawn out to get some understandings about how might we think about this young woman's mental health concerns. So in summary, in terms of the implication for mental health, in terms of both the pieces of work I've just touched on, very briefly, I know, it's important to recognize and value the strategies that girls and young women may use to resist oppression and how they navigate hostile and unsafe environments. Because all the young women and the young women in the serious case review, what they were surviving and they were thriving. And we need to know, well, what were their strategies to survive those kind of hostile environments they were living in? And it's essential to understand how girls and young women utilize their cultural capital to cultivate hope and build resilience for dealing with deficit discourses about their identities. Because without any doubt, the young women in the research that I did were very hopeful and had resilience. We need to be able to understand that and to use intersectional approaches to kind of really get to grips with that, rather than seeing them as from a deficit lens. Because an intersectional lens helps us to understand how intrafamilial and extrafamilial factors intersect to put racially minoritized children at greater risk of developing mental health problems. And I think my time is probably up. So these are the references to the pieces of work I referred to for those of you who are interested in that. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I think my time is over. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Prof. It was an amazing presentation. It's yeah, and I think resonates a lot with some of the things that we have been seeing in South Africa and thinking about intersections of context and race and violence. So very, very pleased to hand over to Smanga now for his presentation. If you have specific questions related to Prof. Bernard's presentation, please do put them in the chat. We will come back to them in our discussion portion of the webinar. Smanga, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rochelle. Just to check, can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Still not.
There we go. And then if you go into presentation mode, brilliant. You're ready to go.
Thanks, thanks, Rochelle, and good morning, everyone. So today I'll be presenting on the mental health drivers among young men in marginalized rural communities and also in urban informal settlements in Durban, in South Africa. So in terms of content, I'll just speak briefly about the state of mental health. I will then talk about our two projects, namely the Stepping Stones and Creating Futures, and then the Siyaphambili project. And then I will reflect on what the data tells us about the social and structural factors that shapes poor mental health among young men. And then lastly, I will conclude with what we suggest that interventions should incorporate in terms of effectively addressing poor mental health. So globally, we see that there is high levels of poor mental health and substance misuse. And we also reckon that women are more affected than men, but in some areas of poor mental health, such as the suicide and substance misuse, young men experience high levels of poor mental health, even though the prevalence is still lower than the women. And this is also kind of reflected in the South African stress and health studies, just to reflect what is happening on the ground. So just to give you a sense of where does our work come from, so we conducted our first Stepping Stones and Creating Futures project in urban informal settlement of Durban. This was in 2015 through to 2019. And then our second study, the Siyaphambili project, was conducted from the urban informal settlement and of Durban and in rural community near the Mozambique border. This work started around 2020. So for our first study, we are drawing from the baseline data of Stepping Stones and Creating Futures. This is the kind of the cluster randomized control trial. So the study basically broadly aimed at understanding whether a combined gender transformative and livelihoods strengthening intervention could reduce men's perpetration of intimate partner violence, the IPV. So for participants to be included in the study, they had to be between the ages of 18 and 30, not be formally employed, also not be in school, and they also had to reside in one of the communities that we were working with. So part of the study sought to understand the prevalences of the suicide among young men who were enrolled in the study. We also wanted to understand how the impact of structural factors shape poor mental health and move beyond the individualized perspective of poor mental health, rather to understand the impact of masculinity norms, the experiences of violence in both childhood and adulthood, and also the issues of poverty and substance misuse. So in the study, we then recruited about 674 young men. Majority of participants were between the ages of 20 to 24 years, and about a quarter who reported that they completed secondary education. There was high levels of food insecurity, with 80% reported moderate and severe food insecurity in the past month. We also saw high levels of childhood adverse events, as majority of young men reported experiences of emotional and physical abuse. And there was over a quarter of young men who reported experiences of adult lifetime adverse events. Also, about a quarter of participants reported engaging in suicide ideation in the past 4 weeks. So when we ran the multivariable adjusted analysis model, we saw that food insecurity was associated with suicide ideation. This might be, there might be several reasons for this relationship. We speculate that one of the reasons might be the pressure on young men to provide for their families and in intimate relationships. And this may be driven by gender norms of male provision. And this is kind of clear indication that they couldn't provide. So the analysis also showed that both childhood adverse events and adult lifetime adverse events were associated with suicide ideation. Men who experience a lot of violence were common, and they reported that they also engaged in suicide ideation. And those who reported increased count of adult lifetime adverse events with 5 to 8 incidents had increased risk to suicide ideation. So we also further saw that there was a positive association between past year drug use and suicide ideation. And one potential reason for this association was that drug use may be used to self-medicate for unresolved traumas, such as experiences of violence, given the lack of psychological care and support in these communities was kind of lacking. So for our second study, which comes from the Siyaphambili project, we kind of sought to co-develop an intervention to address overlapping challenges that young people face working with urban informal settlement in Durban, and also in one of the communities in the northern KwaZulu-Natal, one of the rural communities. So in this project, basically, this was a kind of a joint project of the academics, the practitioners from Project Empower, and a group of young peer research assistants, who we normally call them the YPRAs. They were all employed by Project Empower, and they were involved in the study for over 36 months. So just to give you a little bit about the background of the YPRA, who they were. At the point of recruitment, they were not formally employed or attending school, and they were all aged between 18 and 25 years. We recruited directly from the marginalized communities, as we have touched on this earlier on, that we saw high levels of poverty, unemployment, and substance misuse, that it was common within the communities that we're working with. So with core development methodology, which we will talk more about in the final webinar, this is just to give you a sense of the process that we went through with the YPRs. So we got young people to reflect on their lives a lot in different ways. We then co-developed a theory of change for intervention, and then we collectively developed an intervention and piloted it. So as part of the process, I interviewed the YPRAs at 3 time points to understand their experiences of being involved in the process, and also just to try and get their understanding and how they felt about it. So I'll just spend a little bit of time just speaking about their experiences of being involved. So some of the results, so during the process, poor mental health was the key theme as young men talked about their lives, like Kwanele, who mentioned that he felt guilty and useless, and because you just wake up and you eat and there's nothing. Also, unemployment was another key theme, and not surprising given that the 2/3 of young South Africans are unemployed. So one of the participants, Wanele, mentioned that when you spend a lot of time not working, you end up losing focus. When there is too much time in between, it becomes an issue. So young men also expressed the overwhelming pressures to provide for their families and in intimate relationships. And this was because of they lack work and to provide. And they also kind of talk about, like Ntotuwe mentioned, that we as young men have lots of expectations placed on us. Most of the time, people expect too much from us. They want things that we are not capable of doing. So the wider community context was also an issue, particularly crime. High levels of crime led to constant worry and added on their poor mental health. As Belani, who reported how levels of crime worn him down, as you mentioned, that there is a lot of housebreaking in the community I live in. We are being abused in the community and we want peace. Young men also expressed how they hold on to pain, their experiences of growing up in challenging contexts of experiencing violence and loss impacted on their well-being, and they struggle to talk about this. As Sandile mentioned that I have been through a lot. I have experienced a lot of loss, and my life and my family members passed on in a gruesome manner. So I lived each day trying to forget and forgive what happened. So while core development process was not designed to support their poor mental health, rather it was about developing intervention. However, YPRAs spoke more about being involved and how it helped them that they were involved in the process, and talked about how they managed to release some of their stresses and found a space to improve their mental health. As Ntotuwe mentioned, that I never paid attention in the past to things which could help me manage stress. There are activities we did that helped with managing stress. And one reported that the project changed me on other things. And I told myself that I must do something and not sit around and do nothing. So in conclusion, we saw that the data from both studies shows that structural challenges were key drivers of mental health. And for those who are in the marginalized areas, the risk to mental health is increased. It also shows that masculinity, men's masculinities are important in shaping their poor mental health. So through the Siyaphambili project, we attest to the idea that when we're working with young men to support development, they can improve their mental health. As we saw that through the process, young men improve some aspects of their mental health as well. They became more kind of expressive of their feelings and begin to manage stress. So we also say that to effectively address mental health challenges, we suggest that mental health interventions, including suicide ideation, needs to recognize structural challenges and further work on transforming gender norms that shapes poor mental health. So thanks, colleagues. I have come to an end of my presentation, but I would like to thank the participants, young code developers, the team, and the donors for this kind of work. And thank you all for attending today. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Smanga. That was really great. And thanks to those who have been using the chat to share their questions. So we'll move on to our third speaker now. Ahmed, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah, sure. I will share my screen now. I hope it's visible.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so I will be sharing a bit about mental health in the context of Afghanistan because that's where I'm coming from. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, but my work focuses in the context of Afghanistan and South Asia more broadly. So to understand mental health in Afghanistan, I will just delve a little bit into this current situation in Afghanistan, which is, I guess, like some of the challenges that people are facing are the risk factors for poor mental health in this specific context. So going back to the history, in 2022, the government collapsed and there was a political upheaval when the Taliban took power and took control of the government. And this led to a series of other policy changes in the country, which also simultaneously led to a drastic increase in the demand for mental health. So what happened as a result when the Taliban took power was the government was instantly sanctioned, and this led to a decline in Afghanistan's economy, which caused unemployment for thousands of people in the country, and it also left them with unmet needs. The second thing was about girls and women, which I guess like resonates with a lot of the issues that other presenters have shared. They were doubly impeded, but in the sense that Afghanistan still remains the only country where girls and women are not allowed to go to school. And it's not just educational institutions, but also basic public spaces like parks and gyms are restricted for women to go to in this context. And obviously, in such a situation, domestic violence is about to increase. So there was extremely high number of domestic violence cases, intimate partner violence being documented, and it still continues to be documented. And it's to an extent that some women have even burned themselves alive in some provinces due to the extreme violence that they are facing. And then most importantly, there has been a huge influx of refugees spread across neighboring countries. And what happens is that they leave their livelihood, they leave their houses to go and seek shelter in a different country. So this is a trauma by itself, but then this is also combined with experiences of racism, discrimination, and human rights abuse. In neighboring countries where they're forcefully deported, and they're also being unlawfully killed while crossing borders. So there has been several investigations across borders with Pakistan and Iran, and the human rights situation continues to remain dire for Afghan refugees. And speaking of statistics, there has been 8 million people, 8 million refugees who have been displaced either by crossing border or inside the country in Afghanistan as a result of war and instability. So I guess we recognize that the situation is obviously it's much worse for women and children or people who are living with disability or young adolescents when they're going through these experiences. And when we put an intersectional lens and see how this impacts people who are from the priority population, we get to know that actually their experiences are more dire. And in this specific example, I just wanted to draw upon the story, by their permission, the story of a migrant sex worker who was a client through our counseling program. And she shared about her experience of surviving through sex work in Pakistan, being an Afghan refugee in that country, not being able to get another secure job for herself. But also another issue that she faced was receiving constant death threats from people in her neighborhood, and constant stigmatization and shaming for the profession that she was doing. And so this led her to take attempt suicide multiple times. Fortunately, she wasn't successful. But one takeaway, or I would say two takeaways from this example for myself. One is, when we look at mental health in conflict zones or conflict-stricken areas, it's not just about the residents of the country itself, but it's also about that wider diaspora that are being scattered across neighboring countries. Even in high-income countries, there has been stories or experiences of refugees who have had challenges navigating a mental health service. So that's one intake for me in a setting of conflict. But also, secondly, there's that component of intersectionality, because when we look at mental health as a clinical perspective, we take a linear approach, but whereas when we are looking at it from an intersectional lens, you look at these plurality of different elements that combines together and makes the complex, that's a situation much more complex for an individual. Now, in terms of some policy and practice changes that would be required in order to improve mental health in this context, I guess my first intake on this would be that each context is different in the way that they serve their community. So this means that something that works in one context doesn't necessarily need to work in a different context. And so if you want to improve policy and practice changes, the first thing is to acknowledge that in a conflict-stricken area, you obviously need to think differently and also think in a way that best suits the needs of people. And oftentimes for countries like Afghanistan or other countries who are stricken by conflict, there are other priorities that the government focuses rather than improving mental health. And obviously there are needs for robust capacity building in order to implement something that would improve mental health in this context. So Afghanistan adopted a mental health policy in 1987, and since then it has been poorly implemented. Because I lived for most of my life, I lived in Afghanistan, and when I was advocating there for policy changes, what I often heard as major barriers to do so was people's and citizens' attitudes towards mental health, where it was highly stigmatized and it was never talked about. But also there was a lack of advocacy efforts and lobbying even before the Taliban came. Now that the Taliban are in power, it's even more difficult to advocate for policy changes because they have strict rulings of themselves. And then there are always funding and budgeting issues, which was one of the main barriers to put mental health in the agenda for the government to work on. And so as a result, Afghanistan has relied majorly on foreign aid and international NGOs to improve its capacity and provide mental health services. But what often happens, even with major entities like the UN or USAID, is in their humanitarian aid strategies, mental health is always lacking. So as an example, the United Nations Office for Afghanistan, they appealed for $623 million in funding for 40 organizations. And their main focus was on providing protection, health and nutrition, food security, and anything, and non-food items. So there was anything but mental health. And for me, when I look at development aid policies and foreign aid policies in humanitarian settings, I guess this really creates an interesting advocacy window because the government, of course, we cannot rely on them for improving policies because it's non-negotiable, and there is a lacking space to create dialogue between people and the current government. But there is possibility to alter the strategies and the priorities that foreign aid development programs have, and also to see whether mental health could be incorporated in that. So I have had done a bit of research on this, and I've came to recognize that at the moment, all the foreign aid that's being provided either by embassies or consulates, they focus on providing basic services. And the reason behind this is because poverty is so deeply entrenched in the community that there's hardly any space to think about issues other than fulfilling those urgent needs that people have. So even with Australian foreign policy or foreign aid policy, because I live here, so I have researched a little bit on how they operate, and they also provide kind of like follows the similar pattern where they provide funding to major UN organizations, and then they would try to meet the basic necessities of people, and they often neglect mental health as a basic need for in that list. So when I was previously, when I was saying about poverty, and I was saying how deeply entrenched that is. There has been reports where people have narrated that in rural areas, like people sell their kidneys in return for $200 only, which is not a lot, but it really speaks to the extent of poverty in the country and how difficult it is to put mental health as a priority in developmental strategies. But I guess when we look at it from this perspective, there are these tough and terrible experiences on one hand, and then on the other hand, this creates a cycle of intergenerational trauma for people, and that has resulted recently in higher rates of addiction, suicidal ideation, and deaths by suicide, which caused the UN to launch an investigation into the mental health crisis in Afghanistan. And the result that they found was for multiple factors such as school ban and forced child marriages and unemployment, this number of death rates and suicide rates have been increasing. Now, many organizations like USAID or UN agencies, they haven't established an accessible mental health service for the public. So they have taken some initiative in order to provide support for mental health. But these support programs are specifically catered for people who they are evacuating or people who they have had a relationship with in the past. And it isn't something which is specifically catered for the public. Also, another filter that they apply is that they don't take any cases that deals with extreme sexual violence or abuse. So when you put on these filters, it really narrows down the demographic that they're serving. And it leaves no available support system for members of the public to seek mental health support. And this is in a context where the humanitarian crisis is being named as one of the worst in the world. So some of the issues or some of the barriers as to why UN agencies and international foreign aid development programs are not catering for the public in terms of taking in cases of sexual violence or abuse or trauma is high stigmatization of mental health and sexual health among policymakers and the local government, where it is absolutely unacceptable to speak of interpersonal relationships or sexual health or well-being. And so because there's no space for dialogue with policymakers, and there's also a growing lack of knowledge among the community themselves, this keeps people in a cycle of vicarious trauma and leaves their myths unmet. So what we came to do as a result of these challenges was to come up with an idea of an online counseling program. Based on the stories that we have heard, but also some of the experiments and pilot programs that we did, we came up with an online counseling program, and we have put the name of the initiative as Changemaker, which is basically a youth-led collective that aims to push the narrative around mental health, but also to see how it intersects with SDG 4 and 5 to achieve education and gender equality. So the 3 ways in which we provide these mental health support in education is through counseling, which is a service. We also do storytelling, and we also do some advocacy with the Australian government and other international entities, like Amnesty International and some UN agencies. So some of the activities that we do are reading circles, which are focused on reflecting real life experiences of resilience and recovery. And these are cross-cultural pieces that are being disseminated across South Asian countries like Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. We also do content dissemination, which is curating written and visual content on our social media to increase mental health literacy. And we also do have mental health service, which is open to the public, and it's a pioneer in accepting clients without filtering them based on their experiences. So it's an open source for everyone to come and seek support in all their diversity. So some of the findings that we had from the pilot program is what really works best in the context of Afghanistan or any other conflict-stricken area is remote services, because they're the most accessible. And it also, through this program, we also got an insight into the mental health crisis in Afghanistan. But also it was a good intake for us to tailor a service that best meets the needs of people and the expectations of people, because a lot of them are not allowed to go out of the house. So it really brings that service to them and makes it more accessible for them. And lastly, I guess like some of the things that have worked to make this successful, and I guess for any conflict-stricken area, would really help to be inclusive in its approach, at least like it has helped us in the work that we are doing, is flexible and remote working, which has helped us to reach a wider audience, but also catering for the needs of people and designing services with them rather than for them. So including them in all steps of design, implementation and monitoring. Also catering for survivors of sexual violence and abuse, because the majority of the clients who come and ask for support, more than 80% are actually survivors of violence. So developing survivor-led approach, but also taking a trauma-informed care model. And also having diverse team members across South Asian countries, which has helped us to get an understanding of different needs of the community, but it has also helped to globalize and regionalize the network to meet the needs of people, and also leveraging partnerships with grassroots organizations and youth-led initiatives who are doing similar work in the ground like us. I hope this has been helpful. You can feel free to reach out via this email if you have got any questions. I'm also happy to take them in the chat box or later on.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Really, really powerful. And I think starting to connect across so many of the themes that we've heard discussed by our previous speakers, sort of the importance of co-production and also the importance of intersectionality in thinking about sort of drivers of young people's mental health in context of adversity. Thanks very much. I'll hand over to our last speaker, Serka. And then we will open up to the floor. And I might start with some of the questions that are in the chat when we do that, since we have a few. Please, Serka, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So today I'll be introducing, is that in presentation mode? Perfect. A co-produced policy analysis that I've done. So to give you a sense of the team, there's myself, the project lead. I'm white Irish. I'm an immigrant to the UK. My background is in clinical psychology, and I previously worked as a mental health clinician in community and hospital contexts. So that's definitely shaped my lens or my approach to this project. I work in partnership with a peer research team. So these are racialized young people with lived experience of mental health difficulties during their school. We also work in consultation with a stakeholder advisory group. So this is a group made up of community, school-based, and faith-based providers, as well as policy advisors, policy advocates, and parents as well. The kind of project is supervised by Rochelle, but also Professors Delan Devkumar, Pravita Patalay, and Matthew J. So they oversee kind of my entire PhD project. So the aims of this project were to examine special education needs and disabilities, so SEND policy and guidelines, to really understand the extent to which these policy and guidelines align with a human rights-based approach, so effective and equitable policy, to co-develop recommendations for policy practice, and then also to co-produce some resources based on those findings for families, those trying to navigate the system, as well as those working within the system as well. So first, to situate the project within the UK, this is building on the drivers that Professor Bernard mentioned earlier on. So thinking of a history of colonization. Why that matters in the UK is that it influences migration patterns. It also plays a role in terms of intergenerational trauma. So both directly as a result of colonization, but also re-traumatization through policy and practices. There's also a reality of structural racism within the UK. So thinking about the multiplicit effects of public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms that systematically advantage white British and disadvantage racially and ethnically minoritized people. There's this idea of a hostile environment within the UK, both in the health system. So in the health system, that might be selectively charging people who don't have immigration status. I say selectively because often those who are white presenting, maybe white Australian, are not charged, whereas those who are racialized are charged without status. As well as kind of, I guess, broader narratives when we think about within the community. So state-sanctioned xenophobia campaigns, such as the Brexit campaign, and how that essentially makes migrants and second and third generation migrants feel unwelcome within the environment. There's also this context story of a systematic undermining of community autonomy. So thinking about how there's expectations of assimilation. So a kind of conforming to what it means to be British, whether that's speaking English language, but also a kind of set of core values and how a kind of an allegiance or an oath that's taken to the monarchy. There's also this kind of devaluing of maybe cultural or linguistic or traditional knowledges that happens implicitly. And also thinking about within clinical practice more specifically, how there's an emphasis on kind of Eurocentric or white British as the norm, and also using assessments or interventions that are developed or based on white British classification systems. So how that can kind of ultimately create an environment or a context for policy that might perpetuate inequalities. So special education needs and disability, the system that we're talking about, essentially it starts off with if a child or young person is experiencing difficulties, they should be, in theory, flagged by the school, so a member of the school or a parent or the child or young person themselves can also flag those difficulties. In theory, that should lead to an assessment, so an assessment of need. And if difficulties are identified, then that should lead to SEND provision. So that would be additional support or understanding or grace that's given to the child within the school system. It should also lead to links, kind of whether it's referrals to additional other services or kind of connecting the family with wider social care support networks. However, bias can undermine and derail this process. So it can either lead to pathologizing normal behavior or delaying support and delaying referral processes. So that kind of idea of missed or misdiagnosis ultimately perpetuates the feelings of discrimination within the system and undermines trust. We also know that there are established disproportionalities within the SEND system. So what that means is that minoritized and racialized young people are overrepresented as well as underrepresented within the area of mental health in the SEND system. And on top of that, we know that there are biases within the referral processes. So we know that racialized and minoritized young people in the UK are more likely to be referred through non-voluntary lines of referral. So that might be through social care or through justice system, and they're less likely to be referred to mental health services through primary mental health care, primary GP care, as well as through the school system. So in this context, our aim was to examine the policy and guidelines that make up this system to understand whether the policy is potentially perpetuating inequalities indirectly. So our core questions are looking at the extent of the roles of inequalities or social determinants of health. How much are they acknowledged within these policies and guidelines? How much are the human rights to health and education acknowledged within these policies and guidelines? And the principles of participation and empowerment. So that is engaging the child or young person in their assessment process, in the services that they need, the support that they need. And empowerment is how much are young people engaged with the broader system development and the service development. Specificity, this refers to the extent to which mental health is acknowledged as a type of special education needs or disability. We also thought about cultural safety. So to what extent are practices of anti-racism, cultural safety, cultural sensitivity, cultural competency, any kind of acknowledgement of power dynamics or the roles of culture and bias within the system in a way to tackle them. We also thought about trauma-informed practices, so the extent to which is there an acknowledgement of a responsiveness to trauma or the impact of trauma on mental health and behavior, and thinking about that kind of specificity within the SEND policy and guidelines. Next, our core question was accountability. So what systems of accountability are in place? Who's named as responsible? What systems of monitoring are in place, particularly with respect to monitoring of inequalities? What complaints processes, is there transparency around complaints processes? And what enforcement mechanisms are in place? So how are, failures within the system addressed? Our inclusion criteria was any active policy documents and guidelines related to SEND. And this included statutory guidance, it included non-statutory guidance and policy papers, locally issued policy and guidelines, and public guidelines. So it was across the spectrum. If there was either SEND as a main focus or as a minor focus, so if there was a paragraph or a section that referred to SEND provision, that was included in our analysis. And within that analysis, we looked at both the coded relative text, so the frequencies, how much were these things mentioned, as well as a narrative content analysis. So what were the patterns or themes? And that's really what I'll talk about today. So what were the themes that emerged or themes that we found within our analyses? So peer researchers were involved across this. So both in terms of guiding protocol development, they were heavily involved with, I trained in the peer researchers to assist with data extraction. We together built that coding framework. The stakeholder advisors were also involved in the development of that coding framework. We did a lot of collaborative decision-making, both with peer researchers and the stakeholders informed decision-making as well. And then we also did this iterative process around the analysis and interpretation. That was collectively as a team, both with peer researchers and stakeholders involved as well. We're in the process of developing our recommendations together and building some of those resources based on their findings. So this is really just to visualize the extent to which the peer research team was involved throughout the process. So to give you a sense of what was included, we included 129 national level documents, and then there's 152 local authorities in England. So we looked at every single local authority website and any strategies that were attached to that. And together, I'm going to give you an overview of what the collective results were. Although we have additional breakdowns based on whether or not SEND was a main focus or a minor focus, which shapes things a little bit, but doesn't actually change the main themes. So our key findings for justice and equity. While there was some labeling of inequalities, there was a huge emphasis placed on family-based risk factors rather than the structural determinants of health. So there's really this missing, a pretty big missing piece of the puzzle when so much emphasis was placed on things like attachment. So while attachment can be important, there's a lack of acknowledgement of the factors that are kind of needed, the foundation that is needed so that a family can build an attachment, such as housing security, food security, income security, that can kind of create a safe space so that then a parent can attune to a child. Attachment is also a very westernized concept and relies on, I guess, a norm in terms of what's deemed a normal parenting practice. And so it's kind of thinking about how actually if a lot of blame is placed on the family and these family-based factors, we're not addressing all of these social factors that are contributing to difficulties. When it comes to rights, there was no mention of the right to health in any of the national level documents regarding SEND. There was only 4 local authorities out of 152 that referred to the right to health and right to education. Although we'll give credit, about 25% of the local authorities did mention the right to education in regards to SEND policy. So if we're not labeling the right to health or labeling the right to education, how does this influence the policy and practice that's implemented? So if the foundation is every child has a right to health, every child has a right to education, then there's a kind of an onus or a sense of responsibility that we have to facilitate that, and that this system is supposed to facilitate them accessing health and accessing education. So right now, that's not there. When it comes to participation and empowerment, it's quite mixed. So a lot of, there was a kind of a good mention of engaging families, young people in both their own support development and broader kind of system development. But there was a complete lack of consistency in terms of what does person-centered care mean? What does co-production actually mean? And so there's a kind of a wariness that kind of begs the question, is this tokenism or is it true co-production? We need a shared understanding of what co-production means. We need a shared understanding of why young people or family involvement in their own service or support development, why that matters, why that makes a difference, why that's important. When it comes to specificity, with mental health, there was a huge variation. So we had some really strong good practice examples. We also had some situations where mental health is not mentioned as a special education needs or disability, or the information was very misleading. In 1 or 2 cases saying that this should be the last resort, right? So providing mental health support through this system, it was essentially deterring any effort or any attempts to get support through the SEND system. Even though they're entitled to it, there's statutory guidance around it. So there's this wide variation. And that's important because it highlights a need for us to establish a baseline understanding of mental health and a baseline understanding of the impact of mental health on learning and school engagement. Without that baseline understanding, it's going to lead to wide variation in the support that's provided and a perpetuation of inequalities, right? So the other thing with mental health is that mental health can impact learning and it can impact a child regardless of ability or regardless of their grades. So if we're only paying attention to those children who are struggling academically, we're actually missing a huge cohort of children who are struggling with their mental health, but might be doing okay within a kind of grades perspective. When it comes to cultural safety, cultural sensitivity, anti-racism, it was not labeled in any document at the national level. There was a handful of local authorities who make reference to anti-racist frameworks, and that was clearly community driven because these were local authorities that were in communities that were largely racialized. When it came to trauma-informed practice, we kind of saw the impact that naming something at a national level can have at a local level. So one policy document at a national level named trauma-informed practice, and actually then 25% of the local authorities named trauma-informed practice. However, there's a kind of lack of explanation as to what that means. So, okay, they've named it, and that's good, that's a step. There's some caution that we need to have there. Do they know what that means? What are the implications of this? How are they actually implementing it? And we don't know. That's not clear. And so we need to kind of be mindful of the dangers of kind of buzzwords, and think about actually, what does this mean? Like, what does anti-racism within the SEND system or within the school system, what does it mean? What does trauma-informed schools actually mean? And how are we going to work towards that? When it came to accountability, while, you know, a lot of the times there was kind of one or two people named as responsible, there was a complete lack of explanation in terms of what were responsibilities or roles. And that's across both the national and local level documents. So that lack of specificity kind of disables effective joined up care, and it disables a coherent system, because it means that people end up passing on the blame. And not only does that undermine both the public's sense of trust within the system, like who is responsible for what, but also within the system, it creates confusion, because even if the providers don't have a clear understanding of who is actually responsible for what. And in a couple cases, it even said in the policy, while this is the responsibility of the head teacher, it often gets transferred to the special education needs coordinator. So it is the responsibility of a management team. However, in practice, it's kind of passed on, which is potentially quite dangerous. In other ways, we've got the complaints process. So a lot of the, especially at a local level, the local authority complaints processes were named quite clearly. It was less clear when it came to the schools complaints processes. So they were kind of less transparent, and even more so when it came to discrimination cases. So all families have a kind of a right to bring concerns around discrimination within the SEND system to a SEND specific tribunal. However, the large majority of these the kind of complaints processes were, I'm sorry, I have completely lost my train of thought because someone unmuted. So within this system, there's a lack of transparency around discrimination cases, and they're just not named. So even though you have a right to bring this discrimination case to the SEND tribunal, a large majority of local and national guidelines did not mention this in the slightest. And also then there was
Sorry,
a lack of.
it's me. We're running out of time. Are you
Yeah.
able to wrap up in the next sort of
Yes,
30
of course.
seconds?
So the other things I wanted to flag were, I guess, the there was a kind of lack of transparency around the enforcement mechanisms. So there just aren't enforcement mechanisms in place at the moment. So I guess to give a quick summary of peer research reflections. So this is our peer researcher who was involved throughout the process. And they really highlighted the need to have peer research as a foundational practice from the start, rather than it being an additional add-on, and to think really carefully about navigating disagreements and labeling them upfront. So don't tiptoe around challenges, be thoughtful and intentional about tackling issues together as they arise in a respectful way. So our key takeaways are: we need to label inequality to address it. We need to establish a shared understanding of mental health and what that looks like in the system. And without clear implementation plans, monitoring of inequalities and enforcement mechanisms, nothing will change. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Surka. I think we've had some amazing presentations. It's always so hard because we would love to allow, I think just to listen to all of our speakers for ages and ages, but I just wanted to take an opportunity to go to the audience and also to try to reflect on a lot of the ways that these very diverse contexts and very diverse projects start to overlap with each other. There is one question from the chat, which I think I'd like to start with, instead of the one that I had developed, because that just sort of feels a bit unfair for everybody who's been around for a long time. So And I think this actually could be a question for both Smanga and Circa. But the question was directed specifically to Smanga. It was, what kind of activities did young men engage in during our co-development process to help them manage stress? So, co-development is sort of, and co-production, all these different labels for very similar processes, sometimes can be quite deep, because it is sort of as Circa was reflecting on with some comments from her peer researcher. And I just wondered if both you and Circa could speak very quickly to sort of the practical things that we're sort of engaged in to help facilitate meaningful involvement through managing stress.
Mhm, mhm. Thanks, Rochelle. And thanks, Tebelish. So yeah, I think what worked well and got young people talking about their mental health state, it was, so when we did the artifacts and character creation, kind of those activities, they got a chance, and also a community mapping, they got a chance of reflecting about their own daily lives, and also kind of reflecting about the risk that they face each day. So that process kind of led them to start thinking more about what kind of risk are we facing, and what are things that are affecting our kind of daily lives. But also activities like the I statement were very helpful in them taking a step forward of saying, it kind of boosted their way of communicating with other people and engaging with situations that they faced. In a way, they will kind of, talk about how they use the I statement in terms of avoiding conflict, and kind of help them navigate some of the issues. So there were a bit of other activities like the stretching, the breathing exercises. Those kind of help them take a step back and reflect on themselves, and look at things in a different way. I hope that kind of answers your question. Thanks, Rochelle, and thanks, Timothy.
That's Manga. Circa, do you want to add any other practices you might have engaged in with your peer researchers during your co-production?
Yes, we established some kind of sense of routine that really seemed to work for the peer researchers. We kind of came up with a working together agreement, both kind of individually in terms of what they needed to be able to engage, but also as a team. So we frequently had one-on-one and team reflective check-ins. We also kind of arranged healing activities together. So we built that into our kind of working environment, and always found ways to ensure that we had different modes of communication. So some of the peer researchers felt comfortable kind of speaking up and talking, but other times they wanted to have visuals. We always had options for them to contribute in different ways. And we always kind of said, we don't need to come to a conclusion right away. We can always come back to this. We can always take time to process, because sometimes it does take people a minute to process something, or they might have thoughts kind of in the following days. So there's always opportunities for kind of follow-up.
Great, thank you. I want to take the question or reflection from Nangifa and open up to Prof. Bernard and maybe Ahmed to reflect on it. But in this question, sort of Nangifa sort of draws our attention to potentially the importance for researchers and practitioners to think about crime prevention strategies and sort of the ways in which sort of violence within sort of wider communities is such a key driver for poor mental health, and how do we potentially navigate that sort of intersection within sort of interventions for young people within communities where violence, multiple forms of violence is so prevalent. So I wonder, Prof, if you would like to start, and then Ahmed can jump in and reflect on that.
Well, I think for me, the first thing is to sort of identify, well, what are the particular issues, and particularly in the UK context, where the safeguarding partnerships are, children's services and social services, and it involves the police as the key safeguarding agencies responsible for those particular areas. So a key issue for me is really challenging the the critical area as to how young Black people are often criminalized and of how young Black people are harmed by the safeguarding agencies and are not protected. So for me, a starting point is having those kind of really bold, uncomfortable conversations. And there is a resistance to having those conversations because if your partnership involves, in terms of safeguarding, involves health, and that includes mental health agencies and also children's services, social services, and the police. If there is that sort of elephant in the room, because nobody wants to actually mention that actually one arm of our safeguarding agencies don't actually protect, they actually cause more harm and contributes to young people's mental health. Until you start having those conversations, it doesn't matter what sort of crime intervention systems you develop, it doesn't work because it doesn't see, and obviously here I'm talking about the UK context, it doesn't see young Black people as victims of crime. It only sees them as perpetrators. So until you start having that conversation and acknowledging that, it doesn't matter what systems you develop, it's not going to work.
Yes, trying to think about actually who is the perpetrator of these crimes, problematizing that question. Ahmed, would you like to jump in? Any reflections on that from the Afghanistan context?
Yeah, I guess with domestic and intimate violence, like through the counseling program, what we have noticed is that more than like 80% of people who come and seek for support have been victims or survivors of violence. And oftentimes, like, we deal with these extreme cases of rape or sexual abuse or torture. And what happens as a result is once they get counseling, and this really helps to forge these relationships and reduce the stigma that they encounter in their families. So one way through which, like, we as a team try to lobby the government in terms of increasing access to mental health support is looking at how it intersects with alleviating violence, because people have reported, we do evaluations, and people have constantly reported how their relationships with family members or friends or just in general in the community has improved as a result of seeking mental health support. And it has had a role in not just like in increasing productivity, but also increasing awareness about their self and their rights. So I guess like that there is a strong intersection, but for us, the problem is reducing the stigma around sexual and mental health. And that's where there are some challenges with the local government and policymakers. But I guess like there is an interesting advocacy window to look at the intersection as a way to include mental health in the agenda. So it could definitely be used as a means for intervention.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that struck me a lot is that all four of your presentations made reflections about the importance of intersectionality and sort of trying to look at connections across multiple themes and multiple domains of experience. I wonder if, as a final sort of wrap-up question, each of you would like to sort of reflect on that a bit more, and maybe, what sort of the main takeaway is of what we might gain from these intersectional approaches or these intersectional lenses. Smanga, should we start with you? And then I'll go around my screen.
So thanks, Rachel. I mean, for looking at this work, and I kind of agree with the colleagues. But I'm also thinking about the work that we do, if we do keep doing it in silos and not in collaboration with other people who can help strengthen this work and take it forward. And this is for us because it's more about creating that kind of safer space and safer environment for young people, where they can kind of feel free to talk about their issues. Could be environmental issues, individual issues, and where they can feel empowered. So I think for this work, collaboration is important, and also it kind of speaks to how our interventions needs to recognize kind of different factors that are in play with mental health, and try also bringing in kind of the lens of government in spaces. So because I mean, if you look issues of poverty, if you look issues of violence, that also kind of speaks to collaboration with government departments and other stakeholders who might be involved in helping us deal with this issue of mental health.
Thanks, Manga. Prof, would you like to go next?
I think for me, an intersectional lens really help us to think about how we create, because how we harness young people's voices, because I think young people's voices have to inform anything that's developed in relation to their intervention. And an intersectional lens for me gives us some tools to actually think about how do we create a relational space, because until you can create relational spaces to enable young people to participate to their full potential, then we can't really develop intervention services. And for me, an intersectional lens forces us as practitioners and thinkers and academics to really confront critical questions about the structural inequities that are drivers to poor mental health, and bring young people to the attention of welfare services. But most importantly, an intersectional lens for me avoids that sort of deficit way of thinking and that sort of blaming, that sort of victim blaming that can occur in welfare services. So for me, those things are really important, to think structurally about our society and what that means for young Black people.
Thank you. Ahmed.
I guess just adding to the point that Manga said about collaboration, because we have touched on intersectionality quite a bit. So just like adding my perspective on collaboration and how it has been an important part of like my initiative, because it's being administered online and through like collaborating with local partners. That's like the main way through which we conduct programs, but also make sure that it's running and being evaluated in an efficient way. So I really agree, but with that point, but also collaborating, not just like a youth-led initiative or a grassroots organization with another grassroots organization, but also looking at how major entities could collaborate with community-led initiatives. Because oftentimes there are people who have the most expertise in terms of what people want. And I guess it could be really effective in improving health services and the delivery of healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you. And Circa, please, final word.
I wholeheartedly agree with all the sentiments around collaboration. I guess the one thing, maybe for me overarching, is that we need to think intersectionally to work towards health equity. And if we're not thinking about intersectionality, we're not going to ever achieve health equity. Because if we're only focusing on one aspect of marginalization or discrimination, we're essentially continuing to widen the gap for those experiencing multiple forms of discrimination or exclusion. And so we really need to think about intersectionality and take an intersectional lens to work towards health equity.
Thank you so much. And I really feel like I had a vision for this webinar of creating a space where we could talk about mental health in a way that really holds on to the importance of context and the necessity of context. And I think everyone's work and presentations have really sort of highlighted brilliantly how important that is to sort of hold on to how adversities in people's lived environments are sort of the root drivers and factors that can sustain from the lived experience all the way up to the policy and practice domains, sort of what opportunities for mental health exist for adolescents and young people. And I think so much, it's such a rich conversation, but so much learning that can be used across contexts. So I'm really grateful for your time and your contributions today. So thank you very much. I think now it's my job to wrap up the webinar. Just a huge thanks again to Prof. Bernard, Smanga, Ahmed, and Circa for your amazing inputs and contributions. For those still with us, please do look at the evaluation link in the chat. And remember that this is the first in our series of webinars. The next one is scheduled for the 5th of June at 2:30 p.m. South Africa time. So please keep an eye out on social media for more information, and also links in the chat for you to register if you'd like to attend. Thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.